Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Lost Terror Tapes, where the ordinary hides unspeakable horrors. I know a lot of you use these videos to help fall asleep, but before you drift off, I thought it would be fun if everyone listening could leave a comment to let us know where you're listening from. Before you close your eyes, get comfy in bed and let tonight's tale creep into your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Your support helps us continue bringing the chills, so you're never truly alone, even in the dark. Thank you for your support, and we hope you enjoy the story. Now, let's begin. Gather round if you dare, for these are not mere tales, but the sinister whispers of long-gone park rangers. Their stories, shared only in the darkest of hours and never without reason, are meant to chill the bone and unsettle the soul. They speak of horrors that lurk beyond the veil of ordinary life. Some dismiss these as mere folklore, twisted to terrorize the unwary. Yet none have ever disproven the chilling truths they conceal. Dare to listen and judge for yourself what lies in the shadows. The cabin had no business being there. It simply wasn't on any map, hadn't been noted in any park record. Yet hikers would stumble upon it, lured in by some morbid curiosity. They'd enter and never walk back out into the sunlight. The first time it happened, no one suspected a thing. Some college kid, out hiking to get away from it all. His parents reported him missing. Search parties combed the woods. Nothing. Months later, another hiker stumbled out, rambling about a cabin, blood everywhere. His friend had gone in, never came out. They wrote him off as shell-shocked. But then it kept happening. Guy on a solo hike, a pair of campers. They'd find this cabin and it would be the last anyone ever saw of them. Descriptions matched. Old, weathered cabin, always seeming abandoned. But the rangers could never find the damn thing. They tried. Lord knows they tried. GPS coordinates, aerial photography. Nothing. It was as if the cabin simply wasn't there, until some hiker stumbled into its trap. Theories abounded. Mass hysteria, some wild animal. But the stories were too similar. And then the bodies started showing up. Or at least parts of bodies. A limb, a mangled torso, always near where some hiker had reported this cabin. It got to the point those who knew would not enter the woods alone. But those that never heard the stories or simply brushed them off as folklore did, and they kept finding the cabin. Kept disappearing. The only clue, a smell like old blood and rot that clung to the clothes of those who made it back out. They set traps, thinking animal, but the carnage was too neat, and those few they found pieces of. They weren't mauled, they were butchered. It was then the rangers realized this wasn't about finding the cabin, it was about understanding the monster inside. See, the cabin wasn't just a place, it was a trigger. Something about it made a man see red, unleash a bloodlust, and then, poof, cabin's gone, body parts scattered, and you're left with a hell of a lot of questions. They still search for it, send in teams, but it's like, it knows. Only takes the alone, the unsuspecting. And once you enter, there's no escape. They've tried cameras, sensors. Nothing ever shows up until a hiker stumbles out, rambling, covered in blood. And by the time they get to him, the cabin's vanished once more. Last fellow? He lasted weeks, they think. Kept a journal, talked of hearing whispers, seeing movement. Then the entries got sloppy, hard to read. Last one just said, "I saw my friend by the window." And that was it. He stumbled out of the woods, rambling incoherently for days. To this day, they don't know how he survived and what he saw. They found his friend's head in a bag a week later. Now they don't send in hikers no more. Just leave the woods be, hope no lost soul stumbles in. But you hear stories, campfire tales, of a cabin, empty, waiting for its next victim. And if you're deep enough in the woods on the wrong day, you might just smell that old blood, feel a chill, and see a cabin in the distance luring you in. They've tried burning sage, calling in priests. Nothing seems to cleanse the place. And still, Every few months, some hikers will vanish. They've stopped sending search parties. Just wait for the inevitable. The stumbling survivor, the scattered remains, or nothing at all. Some say, on quiet nights, you can still hear screams. Others, that they have seen shadowy figures darting between trees. But one thing's for sure, that cabin's still out there, waiting for its next victim. And God help him when it finds him. They've studied the survivors, run tests. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. No mind control, no hypnotic trance. Just something about that cabin unleashes hell. They've even tried replicating the conditions. Old cabin, isolated location. But nothing. It has to be that cabin, and only that cabin. Some rangers quit, couldn't take it no more. Others, they've grown old, still searching. But the smart ones, they just avoid those woods. 'Cause when you know the devil's out there, best just to stay away. They've stopped telling stories about those that disappeared. Too depressing. Just toast to another poor soul lost to the cabin. And every now and then you'll see some old ranger just sitting by the fire, staring at a picture of some young kid. Probably one of those poor hikers that were lost, whose body was never found. That ranger sitting there every night remembering, and simply there just waiting. The old ranger's voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that came from years of whiskey and campfires. He stared into the flames, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. "You boys want to hear a story?" he asked finally. We nodded, eager. The night was dark, the trees towering above us like sentinels. We were deep in the woods, the kind of deep where your GPS doesn't work, and you start to wonder if you'll ever find your way back. "This ain't no ghost story," the ranger said, his voice dropping even lower. "This is about the Shadow Man." He took a long drag on his cigarette, the ember flaring bright. It started back in 1920. Folks would come up to the park to hike, just like you boys. But every full moon, people would disappear. At first, nobody thought much of it. Figured they just got lost, maybe fell off a cliff, or got attacked and dragged off by a bear. But then the hearts started showing up. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Hearts, just sitting there in the dirt, surrounded by this symbol, like something out of a damn ancient nightmare. Nobody knew what it meant, but everybody knew that whatever it was and symbolized was filled with a dark, twisted evil. He took another drag, his eyes glinting. Those that swear they've witnessed something deep in the woods that they simply couldn't explain started calling it the Shadow Man. Said it was tall, unnaturally built, and made of shadow and darkness. All you could see were these little yellow eyes, glowing like embers. It had stalked through the woods, quiet as a ghost, and then you'd hear the screams. He shook his head. Nobody ever saw it happen, but they'd find the hearts the next day, always in the same symbol, always with that same ritual look, like it was trying to tell us something, but we never figured out what. He stubbed out his cigarette, his movements abrupt. That's the story of the Shadow Man. Been happening every full moon since 1920, and we ain't never caught a break. No bodies, no witnesses, just the hearts and the symbol. Some folks say it ain't human, that it's something out of an Indian legend. Others say it's just some crazy person living out here in the woods. He looked at us, his eyes hard. But I'll tell you this, boys. I've been a ranger for 20 years, and I've seen some shit. I've seen bears maul people. I've seen folks fall off cliffs. But I ain't never seen nothing like the Shadow Man. That's a different kind of evil, a kind that'll freeze your blood in your veins. He stood up, his joints creaking. You boys be careful out there. Don't go wandering off, especially not at night. And if you see them yellow eyes, just run. Run like hell and don't look back. He walked off into the darkness, leaving us staring at the fire. We didn't say much the rest of the night, just sat there listening to the sounds of the woods. And even though we didn't say it out loud, we were all thinking the same thing. We were thinking about the Shadow Man. The next morning we packed up our gear and got moving. We hiked hard, trying to put as much distance between us and the Rangers' camp as possible. The woods were quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the creaking of trees. It was peaceful, the kind of peaceful that makes you forget about the dangers. But as the sun started to set, I could have sworn I saw it. Just a flash of yellow out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bird or a reflection or my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but the other guys were oblivious, too caught up in their own thoughts. I saw it again an hour later. This time, it was closer, just a pair of yellow eyes staring out at me from the darkness. I spun around, my mouth opening to yell, but then there was nothing, just trees and shadows and that endless green. My heart was pounding now, my senses on high alert. I glanced around, but the other guys were still clueless. I thought about saying something, but what was I going to say? Hey guys, I saw some yellow eyes. They'd just think I was spooked. So I kept quiet, just kept hiking and tried to keep an eye out. But it's hard to watch everything, especially when you're hiking uphill. And that's when I saw it again. Closer this time, the eyes staring right at me through the brush and shadows of the old thick trees. And then I saw the shadow, just a glimpse of it, a towering figure looming up behind the trees. I tried to yell, but my voice caught in my throat. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen. The eyes got closer and closer, the shadow spreading out around them. I could feel a coldness emanating from it, a malevolent presence that made my skin crawl. And then, it was gone, just like that, vanished into thin air. I took off running, not even thinking. I could hear my own ragged breathing, could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, just kept my eyes on the trail and ran. I caught up to the other guys a few minutes later. They were standing around looking confused. "What's going on?" one of them asked, but I just shook my head. "Keep moving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep moving." We hiked for hours after that, the sun dipping below the horizon. We didn't stop until it was completely dark, until we were sure we'd left it behind. And even then, we didn't dare to speak above a whisper. We made camp in silence as our eyes continued to scan the darkness. We didn't dare to have a fire, didn't dare to make a sound. We just sat there, huddled together, and waited for dawn. It was a long damn night. We packed up at first light, not even stopping to make breakfast. We hiked hard, our senses on high alert. We didn't say much, just kept our eyes on the trail and moved. It was late afternoon when we finally saw the trailhead. We didn't say a word, just kept hiking until we were back in the parking lot. And then we ran. We ran to the truck, threw ourselves inside, and locked the doors. We didn't stop until we were back in town, back in the bright lights and the safety of civilization. And even then, we didn't dare to look back. We never went back to those woods. We never spoke of that night again. But I'll tell you this, I still see those eyes. I see them every full moon, staring back at me from the shadows. And I know this, the shadow man is still out there, waiting. They say that if you go into the woods at night, the shadow man will get you. They say that if you see the yellow eyes, you're a goner. And I believe it. I believe it with every fiber of my being. The shadow man is real, and if you see those eyes, just run. Run like hell and don't look back. Because if the shadow man catches you, ain't nobody ever going to find you. Well, except for your heart. Thornridge Gulch was a forgotten place, deep in the mountains of Mount Pines National Park. Once a booming gold mining town in the mid-1800s, it had been abandoned when the gold ran dry. Time had swallowed it, and now it was nothing more than a decaying collection of cabins overgrown with trees and vines. Few knew about it, and those who did never spoke of it openly. The park rangers had their own stories about Thornridge. It was said that anyone who ventured into the old town never came back. Hikers, campers, and adventurers had all vanished there, leaving behind no trace but the sound of their screams carried on the wind. Whenever rangers went to investigate, they found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, but always returned with a feeling of dread, as if something unseen had been watching them. Ranger Andrew Drew Carter had heard the stories from his colleagues, especially the older rangers. Joe Henderson, a veteran of the park, had warned him in no uncertain terms. "Stay away from Thorn Ridge," Joe had said one night by the fire. "You go in there, you don't come out. The place isn't just abandoned, it's cursed. I've seen rangers go looking for answers, and all they find are nightmares." Drew wasn't superstitious. He'd always figured the tales of Thorn Ridge were just ghost stories, meant to scare the rookies. But when a hiker named Tyler Matthews went missing near the old trail that led toward the town, Drew's curiosity got the better of him. He and 2 other rangers were sent to search the area. They found Matthews' campsite near a stream, his gear untouched. But of him there was no sign. And then Drew saw the symbols. Strange, dark marks scrawled across the canvas of the tent, like runes, written in what looked like dried blood. A chill ran down his spine. "We need to get out of here," one of the other rangers said. They returned to base, but that night, Drew had his first nightmare. In the dream, he was walking through Thorn Ridge. The town was in ruins, its buildings sagging and broken, the windows dark and hollow. The symbols he'd seen at the campsite were everywhere, painted on doors, etched into walls, and they were bleeding. Thick streams of blood dripped from the symbols, pooling in the dirt streets. The wind howled, carrying with it a scream, loud, raw, and full of terror. Drew tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The air grew cold, and he felt something closing in on him, something dark and malevolent. From the doorway of one of the cabins, a figure appeared, barely more than a shadow, its eyes glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. And then it smiled, a sick, twisted grin, and reached for him with hands slick with blood. Drew woke up, drenched in sweat. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking. When he looked down, he saw a fine dusting of gold powder on his bed. He stared at it, trying to understand what he had just experienced and where this gold powder came from. The nightmares didn't stop. Each night, Drew found himself back in Thorn Ridge, surrounded by the same screams, the same blood, the same figure with its burning eyes. Every morning, there was more gold dust on his bed. He wasn't the only one. Other rangers that ventured close to that town had begun to have similar dreams, all of them involving horrific details based on what seemed like all too real experiences. Despite Joe's warnings, Drew felt a pull toward Thorn Ridge. Something was drawing him in, something dark and ancient. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know the truth. One morning before dawn, Drew packed his gear and set off toward Thorn Ridge. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The trail was overgrown and almost impassable, but he pushed through, determined to reach the town before sunset. When he arrived, the place was even more barren than in his dreams. The buildings were barely standing, their wooden frames rotting and covered in vines. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest echoes of screams. Drew entered one of the cabins, his heart racing. The inside was worse than he'd imagined. The walls were covered in those same dark symbols, the paint wet and fresh, as though it had just been applied. In the center of the room was a small gold nugget, glimmering faintly in the fading light, calling to him like it wanted him to come closer. As he reached out to touch it, the air around him exploded with sound. Screams, horrific, blood-curdling screams, filled the room, rattling the walls and shaking the ground beneath his feet. The symbols began to glow, pulsing with a sickly red light, and in the darkness he saw them. Figures, shadowy and twisted, emerging from the walls, their eyes burning with the same unnatural light as the figure in his dream. They closed in on him, their mouths twisting into grotesque smiles, their hands dripping with blood. Drew tried to back away, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick, suffocating him. The last thing Drew heard before everything went black was his own scream, echoing through the hollow streets of Thorn Ridge. Drew Carter never returned. His fellow rangers searched for him, but they found nothing. All that remained was a faint sprinkling of gold dust near the edge of the old town. The disappearances continued. The nightmares plagued those who ventured too close, and Thornridge claimed more victims, leaving behind nothing but screams in the wind and the mystery of a town that refused to die. Legend has it that deep within the isolated forest of Black Hollow, there stands an old ranger watchtower, creaking and decayed. Built decades ago for fire surveillance, it now serves a much darker purpose. Every ranger who worked the area had heard the stories. Never climb the tower, they warned. Once you did, there was no coming back. Not truly, yet curiosity has always been the downfall of many. The first to climb it, a rookie ranger named Lewis, returned a shattered man. His eyes were glassy and distant as he mumbled incoherently about a nightmare he couldn't escape. In his vision, he found himself transported to the center of a small, dusty western town. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. Cowboys lounged against buildings, spitting tobacco and watching with dead, indifferent eyes. Before him, a man stood trembling, his hands tied behind his back, the terror evident on his dirt-streaked face. A gunman stepped forward, raised a revolver, and shot the man point-blank in the skull. Blood and brain matter exploded like a crimson flower, spraying the surrounding crowd, but none of them flinched. Instead, they dragged his twitching body to a pig pen. The pigs, half-starved, swarmed the corpse, gnashing their teeth as they tore flesh from bone. The man's final screams curdled the air, his legs still kicking as the pigs devoured him alive, ripping apart muscle, sinew, and organs. The squeals of the pigs mingled with his dying cries, creating a symphony of horror that rang through Lewis's mind long after the vision ended. When Lewis stumbled down from the tower, babbling about pigs and blood, his fellow rangers found him curled in a fetal position, shaking uncontrollably. He was sent home, but the nightmares never stopped. A week later, he was found hanging from the rafters of his cabin, his face frozen in terror, as if even in death he was still running from what he'd seen. But Lewis wasn't the last. One by one, rangers, both new and seasoned, succumbed to the lure of the tower, and each came down changed. The next climber was Carla, a seasoned ranger with years in the field, confident that the stories were nothing but superstition. But the moment she reached the top, the world around her shifted. The peaceful forest below transformed into a dense, choking jungle. Carla heard the panicked footsteps before she saw them. A woman sprinting through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face twisted in terror. Behind her, a hulking figure wielding a rusted machete crashed through the underbrush, his wild eyes gleaming with malicious glee. Carla wanted to look away, but she was frozen in place, forced to watch as the machete-wielding man caught up to the woman. He swung the blade with savage force, the steel slicing into flesh and bone with a sickening thud. Blood sprayed across the foliage, soaking the earth as the woman let out an ear-splitting scream. The machete came down again and again, severing limbs, splintering bones. The attacker was relentless, hacking her apart piece by piece, as if driven by some unspeakable rage. Her cries slowly faded, leaving only the rhythmic thwack of the blade hitting her remains. When Carla came down from the tower, her hands were covered in scratches, as if she had tried to claw away at something unseen. She never spoke of what she saw, but a week later, her body was found deep in the forest, wrists slashed, her blood soaking the earth beneath the very tower she had climbed. The visions grew darker with each new climber. Another ranger, Rick, made the climb despite the warnings, mocking the old superstitions as campfire stories. He lasted longer than most but returned pale, shaking, muttering about the shadows. When questioned, he described the vision in grisly detail. The tower had taken him to the base of a cliffside where a group of hikers were walking along a narrow trail. At first, everything seemed normal, until the shadows beneath the trees started to move. At first, they were subtle, shifting and slithering like dark serpents. Then, without warning, the shadows leapt from the ground, taking form and wrapping themselves around the hikers. One by one, the shadows tightened, squeezing the life out of their victims. Eyes bulged, mouths opened in silent screams as their throats were crushed. Bones snapped audibly, blood vessels burst, and the hikers' bodies convulsed in their final moments of agony. The shadows dragged the corpses into the darkness, leaving only a trail of blood behind. Rick tried to burn down the tower the very next day. His attempts were in vain. The flames climbed high, consuming the wooden structure. Yet the following morning, it stood there, untouched as if nothing had happened. A week later, Rick vanished, leaving nothing behind but a hastily written note that simply read, "It watches, always watching." More rangers tried to destroy the tower. Axes, sledgehammers, even explosives. Nothing worked. Each time, the structure reappeared, whole and unscathed, as though mocking their efforts. Eventually, the park rangers stopped trying. They left the tower alone, passing on the warnings to any new recruits. Don't climb it. Whatever you do, don't climb the tower. But curiosity has a way of getting the better of people. Even now, there are whispers of rangers disappearing, of hikers vanishing into the woods near the tower. There are no investigations, no inquiries. The forest keeps its secrets well, and the tower stands, ever watching, waiting for the next victim brave or foolish enough to climb its steps. The stories continue to pass from ranger to ranger, each one more terrifying than the last. And as long as the tower stands, so too will the nightmares it unleashes on those who dare ascend it. The entrance to the Hollow of Whispers is easy to miss, tucked away beneath overgrown foliage and jagged rocks at the base of the mountain pass. The path leading to it is often hidden by dense mist, as if nature itself seeks to shield outsiders from the horrors within. But to those who know where to look, there's no mistaking the cave's sinister pull. The mouth of the cave yawns open, jagged like the maw of some long-forgotten beast, hungry and eager to consume. Locals tell tales of the first signs of the hollow's trap, an intoxicating smell, sweet and smoky like the scent of a hearty campfire feast. Hunters and hikers describe it as tantalizing, a lure that calls to the primal hunger within. The scent weaves its way through the forest, drifting lazily on the wind. It beckons, drawing travelers closer without them even realizing it. But the deeper you venture, the more that inviting aroma warps into something sickeningly wrong. The sweet smell thickens, turning heavy and rancid like decayed flesh left too long in the sun. The closer you get to the cave, the harder it becomes to breathe, the stench so overwhelming that it seems to coat your lungs in rot. The entrance is dark, impossibly so, even when the sun is high above the mountain peaks. The light is swallowed whole the moment you cross the threshold. For many, this is where the courage falters, a primal fear clawing at the mind, urging them to turn back before it's too late. But some, driven by curiosity, arrogance, or the desire to disprove the legends, press on. As the air turns colder, the cave's true nature begins to reveal itself. The walls are lined with strange markings, deep gouges that look too deliberate to be natural. Long claw-like scratches mar the stone, as though something or someone tried to escape from within. Faint echoes of dripping water resonate through the tunnels, though no streams run through the cave. Instead, the moisture seems to seep from the very walls, slick with slime that clings to the skin. But it's the sounds that are most unsettling, the constant faint hum of something just out of sight, a low guttural moaning, as though the cave itself is alive and in pain. The further you descend, the louder the moans become, until they seem to press against your skull, vibrating through your bones. Some describe hearing whispers in the dark, incoherent murmurs that slither across the mind like snakes, making it impossible to tell if the voices are real or imagined. Legends say the moaning comes from the descendants of the 1800s settlers, a once human family now warped beyond recognition. Centuries of isolation, hunger, and inbreeding have turned them into grotesque creatures, barely recognizable as human. Their skin is pale and mottled, stretched tight over twisted bones. Their limbs are long and gangly, jointed at unnatural angles that make their movements jerky and inhuman. Their eyes, once sharp and bright, have dulled, shrunken deep into their skulls, barely capable of sight, but more than capable of sensing the vibrations of prey. They live deep within the caves, far past where sunlight can ever reach, existing in a world of eternal darkness. Over generations, they've adapted to their surroundings, feeding on animals, and when the opportunity arises, on human flesh. Some say that deep within the tunnels, there are makeshift altars, adorned with bones, both animal and human, offering a glimpse into the twisted rituals the descendants practice to survive. The remains are gnawed clean, cracked open for marrow, a chilling testament to the horrors that have taken root within the hollow. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a seasoned park ranger in the 1930s. He claimed he was patrolling near the cave when he heard faint, pleading cries for help. Thinking a hiker had gotten lost or injured, he ventured toward the source. As he approached the cave, the smell hit him, a sickening mixture of burning meat and decay, so foul he gagged. The cries became louder, more desperate, until he swore they were coming from the cave's entrance itself. But when he arrived, the cries stopped abruptly, and all that remained was the echo of his own footsteps. He never saw what was inside the cave that day, but he claimed he felt something watching him, something that lingered just beyond the edge of the shadows. When he returned to the park's ranger station, he reported the incident, but his colleagues dismissed it as a trick of the wind or the stress of working long hours alone in the wilderness. But when that ranger disappeared weeks later, his bloodied jacket found near the mouth of the cave, the legend grew stronger. Some say the creatures inside lure victims by mimicking the voices of those they've already taken, a grotesque trick passed down through the generations. Hikers, thrill seekers, and even park rangers who venture too close to the hollow are never seen again. No bodies, no evidence, just the growing list of the missing, stretching back decades. Maple Ridge National Park now warns visitors to stay far away from the hollow, but the rumors persist. Even today, some campers report smelling that strange, enticing scent on the wind, like meat roasting over an open fire. And when they do, they know better than to follow it. Because once you step inside the Hollow of Whispers, there's no coming back. In 1982, Pine Hollow National Park was known for its serene beauty and pristine hiking trails. But beneath its tranquility lay whispered legends among the park rangers. Strange, unexplainable occurrences that never made it into the visitor brochures. Park Ranger Bill Thornton, a seasoned ranger of 15 years, had heard the stories but brushed them off as campfire gossip. That was until one autumn evening when he received a distress call that would change everything. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when Bill's radio crackled to life. "This is Ranger Thornton. Over." A faint voice crackled back, barely audible through the static. "Ranger, please. I'm lost. I've been on the Cedar Ridge Trail for hours. It should have looped back, but it hasn't. I don't know where I am." Bill frowned. Cedar Ridge was one of the park's easiest trails, a wide, clearly marked path that even novice hikers could navigate without trouble. "Stay put," Bill responded, grabbing his flashlight and compass from his desk. "I'll be there soon. Just don't leave the trail. Over." The hike to Cedar Ridge was routine, and the fading sunlight cast a warm golden glow over the park. But as Bill reached the trailhead, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. The woods felt quieter than usual, almost as if they were holding their breath. Birds didn't sing, and even the wind seemed to avoid the area, leaving the trees deathly still. Bill began his search, calling out the hiker's name, but his voice seemed to vanish into the dense forest. With every step, a strange sensation grew. The trail felt unfamiliar, though he had hiked it countless times before. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Bill found himself walking in circles. The landmarks were all wrong, yet somehow the same. He passed the same bent tree 3 times, though he'd sworn he was walking straight. As the sun began to set, a deep crimson bled into the sky. That's when Bill saw him, the hiker, crouched by a rock formation, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Thank God you're here," the hiker whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought I was going crazy. I've been trying to leave, but no matter where I go, I end up right back here. Bill's heart raced. He reached for his compass, flipping it open. The needle spun wildly, never settling, as if the very concept of direction had been lost in this twisted part of the woods. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. "We should be heading west." The hiker stood, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not just the trail," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something else. I've seen them. Figures moving in the trees." Bill wanted to dismiss it as panic, but his instincts screamed otherwise. He'd felt the eyes on him too. "We'll find a way out," he said, gripping the hiker's shoulder firmly. "Stick close." They began walking again, this time more frantically. But the forest had changed. The path was no longer clear. It twisted and looped back on itself in impossible ways. Every turn led them to the same clearing, the same rock formation, as if the forest itself was alive, bending reality to trap them. Dusk settled, and with it, the temperature dropped sharply. The woods were now cloaked in deep shadows, and that's when Bill saw them. Dark figures, just on the edge of his vision, slipping between the trees. They were human-shaped, but their movements were unnatural, jerky and fluid at the same time, as if they weren't entirely bound by the physical world. The figures watched them, their featureless forms blending seamlessly with the darkening woods. Whenever Bill tried to shine his flashlight in their direction, the light seemed to dim, swallowed by the shadowy figures. The forest grew eerily quiet, save for the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the soft rustling of the figures moving just beyond sight. Bill's pulse quickened. "We need to keep moving," he urged, but his voice betrayed his fear. The hiker stumbled behind him, his breath ragged. "What are they? What do they want?" Bill didn't have an answer. All he knew was that every time they tried to leave, the figures would be closer, herding them back into the heart of the forest, deeper into the loop. It was as if they were being toyed with, the shadows enjoying their torment. The night deepened and the shadows closed in. Bill tried the radio, but all he got was static, as though the very air had turned against them. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in utter darkness. The only light now came from the faint sliver of moon struggling through the thick canopy above. The figures moved in closer, surrounding them, their forms more defined now. Bill could see the outlines of limbs, but no faces, no eyes. They didn't need them to see. The hiker whimpered, backing into Bill, clutching his arm. "I can't take this," he cried. "We're never getting out, are we?" Bill's voice was a low rasp. "I don't know. Just stay close." Suddenly there was a sharp, hissing whisper from the shadows, unintelligible but undeniably real. It was as if the figures were communicating with each other, plotting, deciding their fate. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, pressing in from every direction. Bill grabbed the hiker's arm and pulled him forward, breaking into a desperate sprint. But it was futile. No matter how fast they ran, they ended up back in the same clearing, the same bent tree, the same rock. The figures were waiting for them, closer than ever, no longer hiding. The hiker screamed, but it was quickly swallowed by the deafening silence that followed. The last thing Bill saw before the world went dark was the compass in his hand, its needle violently spinning one last time before snapping clean off. Then, nothing. The search party combed the forest for days after Bill and the hiker's disappearance, but there was no sign of them, no bodies, no tracks. All they found was Bill's broken compass, lying eerily still in the middle of the trail, and a single note scratched into the dirt nearby. "They hide in the shadows. Stay away." The case was quietly closed, the details buried. No one spoke of it publicly, and the park remained open. But the legend grew among the rangers. Cedar Ridge became a trail whispered about in fear. New rangers were warned. If you ever get a call from that trail, don't go. Don't follow the shadows. To this day, the story of Bill Thornton and the lost hiker haunts Pine Hollow, a grim reminder that some places are not meant to be understood, and some trails are not meant to be followed. It was a fog-drenched afternoon when Park Ranger Frank, discovered the forgotten sign deep within the sprawling Crow's Hollow forest. Its decaying wooden post was barely standing, half sunken in the earth, a grotesque monument to something long abandoned. Black Hollow Trail, closed indefinitely. The words, smeared with years of grime and rot, were barely legible. Frank's pulse quickened. The older rangers had mentioned Black Hollow in hushed tones, a trail where a series of unexplained accidents had once occurred. People who ventured there never returned. But no official reports were ever filed, and the few scraps of information that surfaced were quickly dismissed. Still, there was something wrong with the way they spoke of it, the way their eyes darted away as if recalling something too terrible to admit aloud. Frank should have turned back. He should have called it in. But the eerie allure of the unknown gripped him, urging him to investigate further. He stepped past the sign, each footfall muffled by the thick, damp undergrowth. As he ventured deeper, the air around him seemed to change. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, the usual hum of wildlife absent. No birds, no insects. Nothing but an oppressive silence. The trees along the trail twisted in strange, gnarled shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The deeper he went, the more the landscape seemed to warp, the foliage becoming sickly and pale. The trail led Frank into a dark, narrow valley. Here he found the remnants of the Black Hollow settlement. At first glance, it was a ghost town. Decrepit cabins, their roofs caved in, walls leaning like tired old men waiting to collapse. The air was thick with the stench of mold and rot, and the ground beneath him felt soft and uneven, as though something foul festered just below the surface. Frank stepped closer to one of the cabins, its door barely hanging on by rusted hinges. He pushed it open with a groan, the sound too loud in the dead silence. Inside, the walls were covered in strange markings, etched into the wood as if by claws, depicting twisted figures and symbols. The floor was littered with bones, small at first. Maybe animals, he thought. But as his flashlight swept the room, he realized they weren't all animal. Human bones, yellowed, cracked, gnawed, lay tangled with the others. He backed out, his heart pounding. Something was very wrong here. A cold breeze blew through the trees, carrying with it a faint, eerie sound, like the whispering of voices, but there were no other people around. He strained to listen, and that's when he saw it. A figure emerged from the trees. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, its silhouette hunched and crooked. As it drew closer, the beam of Frank's flashlight revealed the truth. Its skin was loose, hanging from its bones like a wet, sagging sheet. Its face was a grotesque mask of sagging flesh, blackened veins webbing across its cheeks. Hollow eye sockets, leaking a dark, viscous fluid, stared in his direction. Its jaw hung slack, revealing a mouth filled with teeth, sharpened shards that clicked together as it moved. Frank stepped back, his breath caught in his throat, but more figures appeared. From the darkened cabins, from the trees, dozens of them. Their bodies were grotesque caricatures of human form, twisted and contorted in horrifying ways. Some had limbs bent backward at impossible angles, bones jutting through skin. Others were missing entire chunks of flesh, exposing wet, glistening muscle and bone beneath. One dragged itself across the ground, its legs reduced to little more than splintered bone and gristle. A trail of blackened blood smeared in its wake. Another's torso was ripped open, ribs splayed out like jagged teeth around its half-rotted organs, which pulsed with a life that shouldn't exist. Frank turned to run, but the trail had vanished. The trees had shifted, closing him in. He could hear the wet squelch of the creatures as they moved closer. A hand shot out from the darkness. Long, bony fingers, tipped with yellowed claws, grabbed his shoulder. Pain erupted as the claws dug deep, tearing through his jacket and into the muscle beneath. Frank screamed, but the creatures didn't flinch. Instead, they moved faster, their teeth clicking in unison as they closed in. One of them lunged at him, its jaw unhinging far wider than any human should, revealing multiple rows of jagged teeth. It sank them into his side, ripping through flesh and muscle, blood pouring from the wound in thick crimson streams. Frank fell to the ground, thrashing, trying to fight them off, but there were too many. Another creature clawed at his face, peeling the skin from his cheek with a wet tearing sound, revealing the bone underneath. They swarmed over him, tearing at his flesh, biting, clawing, feeding. His screams echoed through the valley, but there was no one to hear them. As Frank's vision dimmed, he saw something in the distance, a figure, watching from the edge of the settlement. Unlike the others, it stood tall, wrapped in tattered robes, its face hidden in the shadows. It raised a hand, and the creatures froze. Their grotesque feast paused for a moment. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through the air. "You should have stayed away," it whispered. "Now you will join them." The creatures resumed their grisly work, and as Frank's world faded to black, he realized with horror that his body was not simply being devoured. It was being transformed. His hands twitched uncontrollably, his fingers elongating, nails growing into sharp yellowed points. His skin began to sag, black veins snaking beneath the surface. His body twisted, bones cracking and reforming in grotesque angles. The last thing he saw before his mind was lost to the abyss was the other creatures surrounding him, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. They had been human once. Now they were something else, something that would never die, but would never live again. When the search for Ranger Frank was eventually called off, the Black Hollow Trail remained as it always had, unmentioned, uninvestigated, hidden from the world. The whispers of his disappearance were passed down among the rangers, a grim story to warn those who might stumble upon that cursed trail. And on some nights, when the fog rolled in thick and the forest was quiet, those brave enough to listen swore they could still hear his screams, echoing faintly from the depths of the Black Hollow Valley. But no one ever followed them. They knew better. The legend of Tahoma National Park is one soaked in blood and terror, a tale that clings to the very trees like a curse. It is whispered among the park rangers, never spoken too loudly, for fear that the Wendigo might hear. The reports began as a trickle. Campers and hikers spoke of strange howls that rose with the wind, an eerie, mournful wailing that seemed to stalk them through the woods. Others reported a figure, something tall and gaunt, its skin stretched too tight over bones that seemed wrong, like a shattered puzzle pieced together by a madman. Most dismissed these claims as wild imaginations. But soon people started to vanish. Ranger Bennett, seasoned and hardened from years in the wilderness, was sent to investigate. He took with him two others, Rangers Malone and Fields, and they ventured into the deeper, untouched parts of the forest. 3 days later, Bennett stumbled out of the woods alone, drenched in sweat and blood that wasn't his eyes vacant, filled with horrors no one could pull from his lips. What happened out there, only Bennett knew. But the search team that went after him found the remnants of his crew, and what they found was enough to burn itself into their nightmares forever. Fields' body had been strung up between two trees, his chest cavity ripped open, ribs spread wide like grotesque wings. His intestines were yanked from his body, hanging from the branches like obscene decorations. The sight was bad enough, but it was his face that haunted the investigators the most. His eyes were missing, hollow pits staring up at the sky, while his mouth had been stretched open and stuffed with his own severed fingers. Malone's body was worse, much worse. His body had been skinned, the flesh peeled from his bones in thin, meticulous strips. What remained was a bloody, glistening carcass, left to rot on a bed of moss. His face was untouched, twisted into a permanent mask of terror, his lips pulled back in a grin that spoke of madness. But his legs had been snapped backward, folded beneath him in a way that made no sense. There were bite marks, deep, jagged gashes up and down his femurs. The bone splintered, like it had been gnawed at, chewed down to the marrow. Yet no one could find the footprints of any predator in the area. It wasn't until Bennett spoke, late one night, long after the investigation had been quietly shut down, that the true horror of what they faced came to light. His voice trembled as he recounted the game. They had seen the Wendigo the second night, a fleeting shadow at first, barely there, just at the edge of their vision. They heard it too, a soft, scraping sound, like claws dragging along bark, following them everywhere they went. Every time they stopped, it was there, watching, waiting. Then the whispers began. At first they were distant, carried on the wind, indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves. But soon the whispers grew louder, forming words, dark, guttural phrases that twisted their thoughts, sending tendrils of fear burrowing into their minds. The creature didn't attack, not at first. It toyed with them, stalked them, let them glimpse its monstrous form, always out of reach, just enough to drive them mad with terror. "It didn't want us to run," Bennett muttered. "It wanted us to break." Malone had been the first to snap. Driven by days of sleepless nights and the constant sound of those whispers, he had begun talking to himself, answering the voices that called his name from the shadows. When he finally walked off into the woods, they didn't stop him. By then, they knew there was nothing they could do. They heard his screams the next morning. It was Field's turn next. He had tried to climb a tree, hoping to get away from whatever haunted them on the ground, but that's where the Wendigo found him. Bennett had heard the cracking of bones before the screams. A sickening, crunching sound as the thing tore him from the tree like a doll and played with him, twisting his limbs into unnatural positions, as though curious to see how far the human body could bend before it broke. And through it all, the Wendigo never fed. No, this wasn't about hunger. This was about the game, the hunt. It thrived on the fear, the madness, the slow unraveling of its prey. Bennett had been the last. He could feel its breath on his neck, smell the stench of rot and death clinging to its emaciated body, but it didn't touch him. It wanted him to see, to understand. And in that moment, he had. The Wendigo didn't need to eat flesh to survive. It feasted on the fear, the insanity it wove into the minds of its victims. That was its sustenance. The final bloody kill was just the climax, a brutal ending to a nightmare already in motion. Bennett vanished a month later, leaving nothing but a trail of blood leading deep into the woods. Some say he returned to the Wendigo willingly, drawn back by the madness that still lingered in his mind. Others believe the creature finally came to finish the game it had started. Today, when the full moon rises over Tahoma National Park, the rangers know better than to go looking for the source of the howls. They know the truth. Those who play the Wendigo's game never come back. Some hunts are never meant to end.